Hello, welcome to another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace. Before I begin, please like, share, and subscribe to my videos both here on YouTube and Vimeo, as well as visit my website, thepacereport.com, for my weekly column, as well as my past segments. There you can also leave comments and reflections on the content that you see here on my show. Tonight here on the Pace Report, I had the honor and privilege of sitting down with a drummer who has created his own lanes, meaning that Steve Smith has paid his dues both in the rock world, as he's a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame member of the great group Journey, as well as he's played and strayed in the tradition of fusion as well as straight ahead jazz with his organ trio. Now, his latest album is entitled Steve Smith Groove, the Blue Organ Trio, and it features Tony Monaco on the Hammond B3 and Vinnie Valentino on guitar. And these gentlemen just recently played Birdland for a week-long engagement, and I had a chance to sit down to break bread with Steve and also members of the band to talk about why the traditional organ trio is one of the most influential, if not important, elements of jazz. I also had a chance to sit down and talk to Steve about his origins growing up, also his start playing fusion jazz with the great Jean-Luc Ponty, as well as talk about the history and the rudiments of traditional drums. So sit back, relax, and enjoy highlights of Mr. Steve Smith Groove, the Blue Organ Trio, featuring Tony Monaco on the Hammond B3 and Vinnie Valentino on guitar and Steve Smith on drums, live at Birdland here in New York City as part of the Pace Report. Steve, I told you a few minutes ago, I've followed you afar for, I guess, 30 something years. And
Wow.
you've probably been on a lot of people's music palette that people just don't even recognize. I mean, you've done Journey for so many, many years, and you're a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer.
Thank
Congratulations.
you.
Jean Lupanti. I mean, your amalgamation steps ahead. I mean, you have done so many things in the idiom of popular music. I have to ask you, as a drummer,
Hmm.
what is it that you bring to these different types of musical settings?
Well, it seems for some reason I can naturally get to the essence of what the music is about. So, so as long as I, play, get a chance to play with the musicians, it seems as though I have an innate ability to figure out what the musicians need in order to make the music happen. And it seems to be, it defies most categories. Not all categories, but most, I would say, U.S. based music. I call myself a U.S. ethnic drummer. And I'm comfortable with all of the music that has found it's developed out of the USA. Going to blues and gospel and early jazz and rhythm and blues, big band, and rock and roll and fusion, and I have a kind of a training that brings me back to the swing era. When I first started out my drum lessons, I was 9 years old in 1963, and I had a drum teacher that was a big band swing drummer. So my roots go back to the beginning, in a way, of beginning of the pulse of U.S. music. The pulse of U.S. music is swing. And at that time, especially like in the early days, 20s, 30s, 40s, all music in the U.S. was swinging. There was no rock and roll, and there was a little hint of Afro-Cuban coming in, in Dizzy Gillespie's music, but it was mainly everything was swinging. And so there's something about having the roots of that swing pulse being in my playing, so I'm not struggling with the feel of any particular kind of U.S. music. Then it's just about the conception, and I'm able to adjust my conception to play the music. Whether I played on a Ray Price record, a country artist, and it was the reason they called me because it was country bass, but it had a big band, so they wanted like a big band kind of sounding drummer that could play country. Now, I didn't really think I could play country, but I listened to a bunch of country records right before the session, and I got the idea. It's not radically different from playing blues, early blues, but it's just maybe the way that you play it, the orchestration. If you have a brush in one hand and a cross stick in the other versus everything with a cymbal and a snare drum, bass drum, and hi-hat. So somehow I've just developed this ability to understand the conception to help people make the music happen.
I read some very interesting comments. In fact, you have a set of videos and a book in regards to the origins of drummers as American roots music appears, as far as the blues.
The history
yes,
of the USB
yes,
DVD.
yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found very interesting, I love jazz. I'm an avid jazz fan, but I'm a rhythm and blues and soul guy.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 40s and 50s, the drummers were generally jazz drummers. There were no blues drummers. There were no country drummers. There were no rhythm and blues drummers. These guys were rooted in American roots music by way of jazz.
Well, if you look at the history of the drum set, it grew up as a jazz instrument. And then if you look at the history of the other roots music, like gospel, blues, and country music, those musics in their infant days, in their early days, did not incorporate drum set. So the drum set was really pretty much only used in jazz and then in big band. And then eventually record producers added drums and then bass to country records and to gospel records and to blues records, so they were more commercially viable. So they sounded closer to what else they were hearing on the radio. They sounded very country without a drum. It's like some guys on a back porch, which is cool. But if they wanted it to be something that was going to get on the radio, eventually they started, like, let's say, bringing in a more commercial element, and that was the drums and the bass. And the only guys in town that they could hire were jazz drummers, because, like you said, there were no country drummers, no blues drummers or gospel drummers in those days. And then after, let's say, a generation of artists making records like that, young kids would come up and they go, hey, I like the sound of the gospel, and I'm going to play the drums, and I want to play gospel, or I want to play rhythm and blues, or I want to play rock and roll, or I want to play country drums. And then people started to, let's say, specialize in different kind of drumming.
Do you think that, Steve, in this amalgamation that you're playing, the Blue Organ Trio, this is kind of taking me back to those Jimmy Smith
Absolutely.
records that my grandfather just loved. I mean, these are these after 12 o'clock records. You're playing dominoes, you're drinking, and you're having a good time. And this setting really accentuates how jazz music has evolved as a trio, especially in jazz drums.
Yeah, the organ trio lineup is a blast, first of all. And Tony Monaco is really a genius Hammond player from the old school, from the deep roots. And Vinnie Valentino's sound is the perfect sound for that classic. And his approach is perfect for this classic organ trio kind of sound, where you're right, it really does come from Jimmy Smith. He was not the first organ trio, but he was the first one to really get this hip organ sound that has been passed down through the generations. And it's really fun. It's like, in some ways, it's close to big band, but we're improvising the hits and we're improvising the arrangement. But it's really very fun, and it's a kind of a relaxed vibe, because even though we have some arrangements, they're pretty loose and open to interpretation night to night. So it's super fun. I'm having a blast.
Tell me the first time you were familiar with Steve Smith.
No?
You know, I did grow up listening to a lot of rock and roll because I grew up in the 70s. So when I was in high school, we used to like to go, you know, before school and drive around and do certain things and listen to rock and roll. But I really started to get to know Steve Smith, through the music of Vital Information. And I got to love Steve Smith's music. And then when I met him in Jakarta, man, it was like glue, you know. So tonight's show and the next show and every show goes up with Steve, and that's what's so great about playing with him.
Tony, you recorded this project. This really goes back to the real roots of great jazz trio records. What was it like recording this project and actually recording it and now playing it out here at Birdland?
Well, you know, a lot of the modern music today has like a different kind of slant, but the Chitlins music is a go music. It's a party music. It's to have fun. So you have to have the reserve to play fine changes and harmony, but you also need to have that like firecracker sense to go and explode. And this is the real music here. It's free. It goes up and down. It breathes. You know, it's real music. So I love playing it.
This recording really showcases how you guys have moved the tradition forward. I mean, you guys are playing some originals and standards. And the thing that I'm noticing you as a musician is that every type of genre music that you play, there's a heart and a soul in this.
Well, I get invested in it. I love the music, and I love the people that I play with. I mean, it's really important that I have a good time with the musicians, and that, you know, that we enjoy being together and playing together. Because when we tour, especially, we're together all the time. So, you know, I love the music, and then we'll be backstage and having a conversation, and then when we get on stage, it's like we continue the conversation, but instead of talking, we're playing our instruments. But it's an interesting phenomena that happens.
Steve, you grew up in a wonderful time in the 60s and 70s when rock and jazz fusion and jazz rock were really the hybrid of American music worldwide. And you coming up from a swing background, because Alan Dawson was one of your instructors.
That's right.
He played with the great Dave Brubeck.
Yep.
How did you manage to stay within the confines of the jazz rock era, but also stay rooted with your deep background in jazz?
Well, the background in jazz, it's just there. You know, it doesn't go away. And one of the main things that I derive from that is that swing pulse, which works in all kinds of music. It works in rock and roll because it's what early rock and roll had, is that, like we talked about, the early rock drummers were actually jazz drummers doing a session. And when you have the influential early rock drummers that more focused on playing rock versus jazz, they still had a heavy swing element in their playing, whether it was Ginger Baker with Cream, John Bonham with Led Zeppelin, Mitch Mitchell with Hendrix, or Danny Serafin with Chicago, Blood, Sweat and Tears, you know, and with Bobby Colomby. And you get that sense of that jazzy swing, but they're still playing rock, you know. And over time, some of that swing factor has gotten lost because you have guys that come up that want to play rock that copy the beats but don't have any swing background whatsoever. You know, they come in strictly from rock first, and they can lose that point, the point of what makes that music feel so good. When you hear Ringo or Charlie Watts, and those drummers had fantastic swing feel because they were so close to being jazz drummers, but because of when they were born and where they were born, they just were on a tipping point of became rock drummers, but still had the elements of jazz, and a lot of the elements of jazz in their playing. So that's not, you know, for me, the biggest transition I had to make, let's say playing with Journey, was to discipline myself to play drum parts versus time. So I want to play steady time, but when I play time, I'm not necessarily playing a part. I'm improvising the pulse, improvising on the pulse, and playing a groove, but it's not necessarily a part. So with rock music, there's a drum part for the verse, and there's a drum part for the chorus, and they're usually pretty regimented. So I had to discipline myself to say, okay, I'm going to just play this beat for the verse, another beat for the chorus, maybe something else for the bridge, and then a little bit of improvisation, but less improvisation and more compositional style drumming.
Now, going back and piggybacking what I just asked and what we were talking about earlier, the fusion drummers, you had Lenny White, you had Billy Cobham, you had these great drummers that really had the sense of time of the rhythm and blues and funk, but they were really coming from a different era as far as the jazz
But they
times.
were also jazz drummers too. Fantastic jazz drummers. Billy Cobham played with Horace Silver. Lenny White, of course, got his start as we know, at Bitches Brew when he was about 19 years old. But he could swing. He still can swing. Those guys. Lenny's got a fantastic feel. Great ride cymbal player. So it's like that's one of the common elements that we're talking about here. Is it all goes back to the jazz roots. But then they were able to incorporate the R&B and the funk of what was going on at that time in the late 60s, early 70s. And it really created a new kind of music, a hybrid kind of music, especially with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. That even though we were sort of hinting there, getting there with Tony Williams' Emergency and Larry Coryell with Bob Moses, like Free Spirits, they were getting there. But when John McLaughlin came up with the Mahavishnu Orchestra and hired Billy Cobham out of Dreams, where they're getting close to it too, really I feel like that's the real birth of fusion. You could go like one little step earlier, Jack Johnson, when Billy Cobham and John McLaughlin played together. That could be like, let's say, the birth point, and then it really developed into something different and very like full blown with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And even over those first two records, you hear a difference between Inner Mounting Flame and then Birds of Fire, when Billy went from a smaller big drum set to a huge double bass drum set and really refined his conception. And he was hugely influential to everyone around him. And that's when I first saw him. I didn't see Mahavishnu, but I saw him with his first band playing the Crosswinds music with Mike Brecker and Randy Brecker and John Abercrombie and Milcho Leviev on piano. It was pretty
That was the ECM. Those are the ECM. Was that on ECM?
No, that was Atlantic.
Atlantic, that's right.
Yeah, because his first record, Spectrum, he never toured with that band. That was with Jan Hammer and Tommy Bolin and Lee Sklar. But then he did Crosswinds and toured with that band. So I saw that band a few times, and it was mind-blowing. And then, I think he pretty much influenced everyone around him, all like you mentioned, like Lenny White, and then, of course, Narada Michael Walden, who continued on with Mahavishnu, and even Tony Williams. I think Tony definitely was a great genius, and he made a transition from how he played in the 60s with Miles. He started developing jazz rock in 69 and 70. But then when he had that band, the new Tony Williams Lifetime with Alan Holdsworth, which I saw that band a lot of times, that was like a whole new Tony. And then with the big yellow Gretsch drum set with 3 floor toms and rack toms. And eventually Tony, I think, did something very interesting, which is he was playing this fusion style then. And later in his life, in the 90s, he really just kind of fused it all together into a jazz style that incorporated the fusion approach as well. So he just kind of did an integration of his whole career and wrote some beautiful music for those final Blue Note albums that he recorded.
What was it like recording this project?
The Groovin Blue project, that was just, kind of something that we've always wanted to do. From the time that I played the very first tour I did with Steve, I said, man, we got to do an organ trio record, and then we played with Tony Monaco at the Java Jazz Festival, and it was just, I said, okay, we're going to Cleveland. On the way home, we're going to stop off in Columbus, and we're going to make a record. And that's what we did. And against all odds, really, because there was a lot of things that came up during that time that made it kind of difficult. But we made it happen, and we just played the music, and for us, it was just being honest and doing what we do.
The world got a whiff of you when you first played with Jean LePonty, and Jean was also on the cusp of prog rock / fusion / classical, because he still does that in a sense, and world music.
Yeah.
What was that like, jumping into a ring of fire? Because it was the first time you played fusion jazz.
It really was. I was a student at Berkeley from 72 to 76. I was in my 7th semester, and I heard about an audition in New York. So I was able to get invited to the audition. A friend of mine, Jeff Berlin, was playing bass at the audition, and Jeff recommended that I come down and do the audition. So it was a cattle call audition with about 7 drummers sitting in a hallway at a rehearsal studio, and one at a time we went in. And I was lucky that I got the gig. One reason is I could read music, and he needed somebody that could read music and learn the music quickly. And the pieces started to come together. I was playing mainly small group jazz, big band jazz. I was hearing fusion, listening to fusion music, but I wasn't really playing it so much. It was very new, and hadn't in a way worked its way down into the colleges yet. And I was just trying to get gigs around Boston, and most of those gigs were like playing little top 40 bands or wedding bands or big band gigs, or trio gigs, jazz gigs, things like that. There wasn't much work in fusion at that time. We didn't think about it as fusion. We thought about it as jazz. And this is what's going on in the forefront of jazz, is playing like this. But when I started to play with Ponty, I quite naturally, let's say, developed an ability to play this kind of rock style, just because I grew up at that time, mid to late 60s and early 70s. So that came pretty naturally. And then I got my butt kicked because those players were really strong, very consistent night after night. And I went from being some kind of ideal, like a college kid with these high ideals, to like just the reality of what it takes to play at a high level every night, very consistently, put on a good show. It was really a heavy education. And during that time I played with him, I started out with a little jazz drum set, and then he said, can you get a big drum set that looks like a Billy Cobham set? 2 bass drums and a bunch of toms. And I said, all right, I can do that. So I bought my first Sonar drum set in January 1977 and started to play like with that big kind of rock fusion approach. And I had a lot of fun with it. I liked it, and so I continued to play with him to 77. And then when I left the band and moved to Los Angeles, I was more inclined to do gigs where I could use that big drum set. And eventually that led me to being in Journey versus continuing with jazz and fusion at that time. There was an opportunity. They heard me play. They liked what they heard and asked me to be in the band. And I said, well, that'll be interesting. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to make a bunch of money with this band. It was like a band that was up and coming. They were in debt, and they made me a band member, which meant that I inherited whatever debt that they had. So there was no guarantee I'd make any money. But it was an exciting new thing. I was about 24 years old, so it seemed like a interesting musical, I guess, little avenue or a detour or whatever. It turned into kind of, in a way, a detour, meaning when I did 7 years playing with Journey, it was like, getting an education in the music business and how to be a compositional rock drummer. But I realized my heart really lies in playing jazz, and so when that experience ended in 1985, I was fortunate to jump right back in and start playing with Steps Ahead after that. And the fact that I was in Journey and what I learned discipline-wise worked with Steps Ahead, because that was a band, or is a band, that's had many incarnations, that uses elements of jazz and rock. Like, it's not like just a very free jazz group. It's got very disciplined parts, though it includes elements of rock, and then there's the freedom of improvisation. So it was a good fit for me to make that transition to Steps Ahead.
There was a record that Neil Schon recorded with him and Jan Hammer. And I have to ask you, because Neil got his feet wet with Santana, the original Santana band.
Yeah.
Neil's an incredible musician, and he was kind of music forward. And what was the vision like, and what was the collaboration recording those songs? Because, when I think of Journey, I think of some solid hits you guys had. I mean, you guys laid some ballads, and you had some great fast stuff also.
Right. So you're asking, like, what?
Yeah. What was it like collaborating with Neil? Because he really, and in my opinion, he's one of the musicians that is criminally unsung in the industry.
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, in 1983 is when he made the first album with Jan Hammer, and those records are fantastic. I still like listening to those albums, and Jan sounds great. He plays drums and keyboards and bass, and Neil plays great guitar and sings on those records. And those were really strong records. That was the same year I made my first Vital Information record.
Right.
And because we all wanted to do some different things, some solo projects. And I can understand, like, they were able to, Jan and Neil made that record probably in a couple of weeks, and I've had that experience with Neil quite a few times too. Like, his last few solo records I played drums on, so essentially we can get together and start jamming, and I play compositional style drums and with him, and then he has just infinite number of riffs and ideas, and then we just start to organize those riffs and turn them into complete songs. And it was a very similar process that happened with Journey. All the guys in the group were very creative and would come up with interesting parts, and then we would hone those into complete songs. So it was generally the case that the songs came out of jams, and the keyboard player would have a riff or just a chorus, and then we'd mess around with it, and Steve Perry would find a melody over that, and we'd come up with a verse and come up with a bridge, and it all happened in a rehearsal studio. And within, like, we would set aside about a month and just start jamming and writing tunes and come out of there with a complete album, and then make that album, go on tour, come back, do it again. It was like a never-ending cycle of just writing, recording, and touring.
my viewers watch these segments to get insight on how a musician thinks and how they put their vision together. Tell my viewers out here how you developed your style and how you came into your own as far as finding yourself as one, a musician,
Yeah.
and two, a rock drummer as well as a jazz drummer.
Okay, well, developing your style, in a way, I don't think you have too much control over that. Maybe some, but if you get some foundationary training, I don't know what it's like to be a drummer that is, the quote unquote self-taught, because I started right away with lessons and right away, and I feel fortunate that I had a very good direction of the rudiments and the roots of jazz and swing music, and then in a way I feel like all musicians that are good musicians are self-taught also, because there's no way that a teacher can teach you how to play music. They can give you the tools and guide you to the tools that you need technically to play music, but in order to really make music, that's a self-taught skill that develops with experience. It develops by having a lot of experiences. So, I had a good fundamental background that helped define my style, one would say, because I had this kind of jazz background originally. And then the rest of, let's say, the development of the style comes from what opportunities come your way, and that if you take those opportunities, if you're ready for them, and then you take them. So I might have never played fusion had I never had the opportunity to play with Jean-Luc Ponty. And so I did have that opportunity. So then that became part of my wheelhouse, became part of my style. And then eventually I played in Journey, and so then it's like, okay, I got a gig, let me focus on how to really play this gig, master this gig. So I dug deep into, really doing a lot of history homework of the rock drummers, just like really listening, and then being in the room with the musicians and allowing them to guide me. Those are your best teachers. Eventually, is the people that you're playing with, and whatever the situation is. And so, and then like we talked after that, I went to Steps Ahead. I did a short stint with Ahmad Jamal, and then, I had my own band, or have my own band, Vital Information. And then every time I end up playing with people, it expands my style. But it's not something I sat down and said, well, I want to develop this. At a certain point, you can make those decisions, but in a way, some of it is just due to the opportunities that come your way. And similarly, that's how my investigation of Indian rhythms happened. An Indian musician hired me to play because they knew I could read music, and they had charts, and it was like I just got my foot in the door and started playing the music, and I found it fascinating. So that led me to wanting to study it and develop it.
What is your take on guys like Trilak Gurtu? His sense of timing is just, I can't even describe it. He's a beast when he plays.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He's a great example of somebody that's developed a real hybrid approach, because he comes from the tabla tradition, North Indian tabla tradition, but he's incorporated all kinds of the elements of the drum set into his own unique vision of how to play rhythm. So I think he's classically trained as an Indian musician, but he brings in the elements of jazz, and he brings in like some funk, and puts it all together and writes some very interesting music. So he's incredible. I started playing with Zakir Hussain in 2003. We were in a band called Summit with George Brooks, Kai Eckhart, and Fareed Haq, and that was a very educational experience, because we were all playing this hybrid, Indian, Western fusion, Indian music kind of hybrid, and that was truly going to school. And then I got introduced to a lot of great Indian musicians, and have studied with them, and then played with them, and that's really where it's not just studying, but it's then, okay, now we're going to play this tonight. So you got to not only just learn it, but you got to really be able to perform it
So, Steve, what's the difference between playing Indian rhythms and, say, a heavily syncopated Afro-Cuban beat?
That I don't know. See, because there I don't know much about Afro-Cuban. That's why I'm really clear. To me, it's like I really have fun with the Indian music, and I love incorporating that music into what I do, and to a degree, I've been accepted into the Indian community and do have people that I play with there. But see, the Afro-Cuban thing, I love it, but I really don't know so much about it. And but I don't want to put too much on my plate. But listening to Afro-Cuban drummers is where I really came up with the idea of this, U.S. ethnic drummer, because as I talked to the drummers, most of the Cuban drummers or Puerto Rican drummers, most of them knew their history and their background and where this rhythm came from and that rhythm and folkloric music, and it made me think, I should do that with U.S. music, because as much as I try to play in the style and genre that they play, I didn't grow up there, but I did grow up here in the USA, and I do have it's like an inborn understanding of the music because it's in the culture.
Smith, I always ask this to all the musicians, and this is the hardest question. Steve Smith, what does jazz music mean to you?
It is a hard question. It, in some way, for me, it's like an ultimate music that utilizes my technique, my heart and soul, my intellect, the ability to communicate with the people on stage and communicate with the audience. So it's a very high level form of communication and having an experience like physically and mentally, because there's a lot of training that goes on before you can start to play jazz, and then as you continue to play jazz, you really have to know a lot about music because you're involved in instant composition in a lot of ways. That's how you could, one way to see it. But when you do it, you have to be very relaxed, and you have to be in touch and be able to draw upon all these ideas, whether they're technical or intellectual, and then just allow the music to happen. So even though I'm guided by those ideas, when it comes right down to it, you just have to relax and let it flow.
That'll do it again for another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace. I'd like to personally thank the incomparable Steve Smith for his time. For more information on Steve Smith Groove Trio, please visit him online at vitalinformation.com. There you'll also find out more information about his upcoming tours with the trio, in addition to his group Vital Information, as well as his tour dates with the legendary rock group Journey. Also, I'd like to personally thank Tony Monaco as well as Vinnie Valentino for their comments. Also, the staff and management at Birdland for their warm hospitality. Please visit my website, thepacereport.com, for my weekly column as well as my past segments. And please like, share, and subscribe to my videos both on YouTube and Vimeo. Until next time, remember, if it's in the groove, it'll make you move. Till next time, peace.